Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the very top of the world, where the air is so cold it feels brittle, like thin glass. There is no sound here except for the wind, a low rhythmic moan that has traveled thousands of miles across an unbroken desert of white. This is not a desert of sand, but of ancient, pressurized snow. You are standing on the Greenland ice sheet, a frozen monument to time itself. Beneath your feet lies a history that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, locked in layers of ice that are miles thick. It is a place of profound, almost alien beauty, where the sun may not set for months, circling the horizon like a gold coin that refuses to fall, or where the darkness of winter is so absolute that the stars seem close enough to touch. This is Greenland, a land that has captured the imagination of explorers, kings, and presidents for centuries. It is the largest island on Earth, a place that is geographically part of North America, but politically and culturally tied to Europe. For the United States, it has been a long-standing obsession, a strategic prize sought by leaders from the 19th century to the 21st. But before the diplomats began their bargaining and the generals began drawing their maps, Greenland was a world of ice, bone, and a survival, so unlikely it borders on the miraculous. To understand why modern nations would move heaven and earth to claim this territory, we must first sink into the deep silence of its origins and the arrival of the first humans who dared to call this frozen fortress home. The ice is the true protagonist of this story. It covers 80% of the island, a massive dome that reaches heights of over 10,000 feet. It is so heavy that it has actually pushed the center of the island's bedrock down, creating a hidden basin that sits below sea level. This is not just frozen water, it is a living archive. Every year for millennia, a layer of snow has fallen, trapping tiny bubbles of air from that specific moment in history. When scientists drill deep into the ice today, they are breathing the atmosphere of the Roman Empire, the air of the Middle Ages, and the dust of volcanic eruptions that happened before the dawn of civilization. But this ice is not static, it flows. It groans under its own weight, creeping slowly toward the jagged coastlines. When these massive glaciers reach the sea, they calve, breaking off into icebergs that can be the size of small cities. These are the white ships of the North Atlantic, drifting southward in a slow, majestic procession. It was likely one of these very icebergs, born in a Greenlandic fjord, that crossed paths with the Titanic in the dark waters of 1912. The ice gives Greenland its character, unyielding, beautiful, and profoundly indifferent to the presence of man. Yet, man did come. Long before the Vikings or the Danish explorers, the first pioneers arrived from the west. Around 4,500 years ago, during a period of relative warmth, the Sakak people crossed the narrow, ice-choked straits from what is now Canada. They were the first to face the silence. They were masters of the high Arctic, surviving in a landscape that offered no timber for heat and no soil for crops. They hunted seal and caribou, using tiny, exquisitely crafted stone tools to process hides and meat. Their lives were a testament to the limits of human endurance. They lived in tents made of animal skins, weighted down by stones that can still be found today, arranged in circles on the tundra like tiny forgotten monuments. They were followed by other groups, like the Independence culture and the Dorset people, each arriving and vanishing in waves, their fates tied to the shifting climate. When the ice expanded, they were pushed south or faded away. When it retreated, they followed the game north. For thousands of years, these Paleo-Inuit were the only human heartbeat in this vast white expanse, living in a world where the line between life and death was as thin as a single successful hunt. The European chapter of Greenland's history began not with a grand expedition, but with a family feud and a man of violent temper. In the late 10th century, the Norse world was expanding, and Iceland was becoming crowded. Among the settlers was a man named Eric the Red, so called for the colour of his hair and perhaps his fiery personality. Eric was a man familiar with exile. His father had been banished from Norway for manslaughter, and Eric himself was eventually declared an outlaw in Iceland after a series of bloody disputes with his neighbours. With the gates of his community closed to him, Eric turned his eyes toward the unknown. He had heard rumours of a land to the west, seen by sailors blown off course by the fierce North Atlantic storms. In the year 982, Eric set sail in a longship, an open wooden vessel that would seem terrifyingly small to a modern observer. For 3 years, he explored the southwestern coast of the island. He found deep, winding fjords where the mountains shielded the land from the worst of the polar winds. In these hidden pockets, he found something he hadn't expected: green meadows. The climate of the 10th century was what we now call the medieval warm period. It was significantly milder than it is today, and for a few months a year, the southwestern fringes of Greenland looked almost habitable to a Norse farmer. Eric was not just an explorer. He was a visionary and, more importantly, a salesman. He knew that if he wanted to build a new life, he needed a community. When his period of outlawry ended, he returned to Iceland with a brilliant piece of marketing. He called the land Greenland. He believed, quite correctly, that people would be more likely to follow him if the land had an attractive name. He painted a picture of a frontier where a man could own his own land, where the pastures were rich and the seas were full of walrus and whale. His pitch worked. In 985, a fleet of 25 ships laden with families, livestock and tools set out for the west. Only 14 ships survived the treacherous journey through the ice-clogged waters. But those who arrived established a colony that would last for nearly half a millennium. For several centuries, a unique Norse society flourished on the edge of the world. They established 2 main areas: the eastern settlement near the southern tip, and the western settlement further up the coast near modern-day Nuuk. At its peak, the population reached perhaps 5,000 people. These were not the Viking raiders of popular myth, but farmers, hunters, and traders. They built sturdy stone farmhouses with turf roofs to trap the heat. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, though the animals were often stunted by the harsh conditions and had to be kept indoors for most of the year. Most impressively, they maintained their connection to Europe and their identity as part of Western Christendom. They built 16 churches and even a cathedral at Gardar, which featured a magnificent bronze bell and imported glass windows. The bishops of Greenland were appointed by the Pope, and the settlers paid their tithes to Rome in the form of walrus ivory and polar bear skins. This ivory was the white gold of the Middle Ages. In a time when the Crusades had made elephant ivory from Africa and the East difficult to obtain, the walrus tusks of Greenland became the primary source of luxury material for Europe's elite. It was carved into intricate crucifixes, jewelry boxes, and the famous Lewis chessman. This trade was the colony's lifeline. In exchange for ivory, the Greenlanders received the things their island could not provide: iron for tools, timber for ships, and grain for bread. For a long time, the arrangement worked. The Norse Greenlanders were the masters of the North Atlantic trade, their ships plying the waters between the fjords and the ports of Norway. They were a people who lived on the knife edge of survival, yet they found time to build stone walls and pray in cathedrals, a small, stubborn flame of European culture burning in the vast Arctic dark. But as the 13th century drew to a close, the world began to grow cold. The medieval warm period was ending, giving way to what historians call the Little Ice Age. The winters became longer and more brutal. The sea ice began to expand, staying in the fjords longer and making the passage for trade ships increasingly dangerous. At the same time, the market for walrus ivory began to collapse as elephant ivory once again became available in Europe. The Greenlanders were becoming isolated, their economic reason for existence fading just as the environment became more hostile, and they were no longer alone. From the far north, a new people were moving down the coast. These were the Thule, the ancestors of the modern Inuit. Unlike the Norse, who were trying to force a European farming lifestyle onto a landscape that didn't want it, the Thule were perfectly adapted to the cold. They brought with them the kayak, the dog sled, and the toggle harpoon. They knew how to hunt the great bowhead whale and how to live comfortably on the sea ice. The relationship between the Norse and the Thule remains a subject of intense historical debate. The Norse sagas contain brief, often fearful accounts of encounters with the Skraelings, a term they used for the newcomers. While there were likely skirmishes, there was also likely trade and a quiet observation of two very different ways of life. But as the climate continued to deteriorate, the Norse refusal to adapt became their undoing. They continued to value cattle over seals and wool over furs. They clung to their European identity, even as the ships from Europe stopped coming. The last ship, known to have visited the colony, departed in 1410, carrying news of a wedding at Folsey Church. After that, the historical record goes silent. When Danish ships finally returned in the early 18th century, they found only the skeletal remains of stone buildings. The Norse were gone. Whether they succumbed to famine, were overwhelmed by the Thule, or simply abandoned their farms and tried to return to Iceland, no one knows for sure. The silence had reclaimed the settlements, leaving only the Inuit to navigate the ice. This period of the long silence is crucial to understanding Greenland's future. For 3 centuries, Europe largely forgot about the island, yet the Danish-Norwegian crown never officially relinquished its claim to it. They viewed it as a lost province, a ghost on their maps. While the Inuit lived their lives according to the ancient rhythms of the hunt, moving with the seasons and the ice, the kings in Copenhagen were beginning to look north once again. They were driven by a mix of religious zeal, hoping to find the descendants of the Norse and convert them back to the faith, and a growing sense of imperial competition. As the world entered the age of exploration and empire, Greenland was no longer just a memory of Eric the Red. It was becoming a strategic territory in a world that was suddenly becoming much smaller. By the time the 1700s arrived, the Arctic was being viewed through a different lens. It was no longer just a place of ice and bone, but a potential gateway. The search for the Northwest Passage, a sea route to the riches of Asia, was becoming an obsession for the great powers. Greenland sat like a giant sentinel at the entrance to that passage. The Danish missionary Hans Egede arrived in 1721, marking the beginning of the modern colonial era. He didn't find the Norse, but he found a thriving Inuit culture and a land that held more promise than the legends suggested. He established what is now Nuuk, and the Danish flag was firmly planted in the frozen soil. This transition from a Viking outpost to a modern colony sets the stage for everything that follows. It established the legal and political framework that would one day lead to American interests. As the 18th century turned into the 19th, The United States was a young, hungry nation, expanding across its own continent and looking toward the oceans. The Americans were beginning to realize that the security and prosperity of their new republic depended on who controlled the waters to their north. They began to look at the maps, and they saw the massive white wedge of Greenland hanging over the Atlantic. They saw the Danish claim as a fragile one, and they began to wonder if the Greenland purchase might be the logical conclusion to their manifest destiny. The silence of the ice was about to be broken by the noise of industry and the sharp calculations of diplomacy. The era of the Viking and the lone hunter was ending, and the era of the geopolitical strategist was beginning. Greenland, the island Eric the Red had named as a marketing ploy, was about to become the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet. But as the first American diplomats began to whisper about the island's potential, the ice simply continued its slow, indifferent crawl toward the sea, a reminder that in this land, nature always has the final word. The stage was set for a centuries-long tug-of-war, a story of gold, strategy, and the enduring lure of the North. As we move into the 18th century, the silence that had swallowed the Norse settlements for 300 years began to lift. Greenland was no longer just a fading memory in the sagas or a ghost on a map. It was becoming a focal point for a renewed sense of European mission and the early stirrings of global strategy. While the Inuit continued to hunt the seal and the whale, navigating a landscape they understood with an intimacy no European could match, the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway began to look toward the horizon with a mix of curiosity, religious duty, and commercial ambition. This era marks the transition of Greenland from a mythic land of ice and bone into a formal colonial territory, a transformation that would eventually place it directly in the path of a rising American empire. The man who truly reopened the door to the Arctic was a Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede. In the early 1700s, Egede became obsessed with the fate of the lost Norse colonies. He feared that if any descendants of Eric the Red still lived in Greenland, they had surely fallen away from the Christian faith, or, perhaps worse in his eyes, remained Catholic in an era where Denmark had long since embraced the Reformation. He petitioned the Danish king, Frederick IV, for years, seeking permission to lead an expedition to find these lost souls. The king, however, was less interested in lost souls and more interested in the potential for trade. The North Atlantic was becoming a theatre of competition, and the idea of re-establishing a presence on the world's largest island held a certain imperial weight. In 1721, Egede was finally granted permission and funding, not just as a missionary, but as a representative of the Bergen Greenland Company. When Egede's ship, the Hope, sighted the jagged coastline of West Greenland in July of 1721, he did not find the stone cathedrals and Norse farmers he had imagined. Instead, he found the ruins of Valsey and Gardar, overgrown with moss and reclaimed by the frost. The Norse were truly gone, but the land was very much alive. He encountered the Inuit, a people whose technology and social structures were perfectly tuned to the rhythm of the ice. Egede's mission shifted from reclaiming lost Christians to converting the heathen population. He established a settlement near the mouth of a massive fjord system, naming it Godthaab, or Good Hope. Today, we know this city as Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. This small cluster of wooden buildings was the first permanent European footprint in the modern era, and it signaled the beginning of a deep, often complicated relationship between the Danish crown and the Arctic people. Life for these early Danish colonists was a grueling test of patience and health. They were thousands of miles from the comforts of Copenhagen, dependent on supply ships that were often delayed by storms or ice. Scurvy, loneliness, and the sheer psychological weight of the long polar night took a heavy toll. Yet the Danes were persistent. They realized that while the Norse had failed as farmers, the island could succeed as a commercial outpost. The 18th and 19th centuries were the golden age of whaling. The waters of the Davis Strait and Baffin Bay were teeming with bowhead whales, creatures that were essentially swimming gold mines for their oil and baleen. Danish, Dutch and British whaling fleets crowded the waters, and Greenland's coast became a vital staging ground. The Royal Greenland Trading Department was formed, establishing a monopoly that would control the island's economy for nearly 200 years. Greenland was no longer a void, it was a resource. As the 1800s progressed, the geopolitical landscape of the world began to shift. The Napoleonic Wars redrew the map of Europe, and in 1814, the union between Denmark and Norway was dissolved. While Norway was ceded to Sweden, Denmark managed to retain the Atlantic islands, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. This was a pivotal moment. It solidified Greenland's status as a specifically Danish possession, a tiny European kingdom holding on to a massive Arctic territory. But Denmark was a middle power, and its grip on such a vast expanse was largely symbolic. Most of the island remained unexplored by Europeans, its interior a white mystery, and its northern reaches a terrifying wall of ice. It was during this time that the Great Game of the North began to take shape. The British Royal Navy was obsessed with finding the Northwest Passage, a shortcut to the Pacific that would bypass the long journey around the tip of South America. Expedition after expedition sailed past Greenland's shores, led by men like John Ross and William Parry. Greenland was the gateway, the last place to take on fresh water and coal, before plunging into the labyrinth of the Canadian Arctic. These explorers mapped the coastlines with increasing detail, and in doing so, they revealed the island's immense scale to the rest of the world. They also brought news of the Inuit of the far north, the polar Eskimos, who had lived in such isolation that they believed they were the only humans in the world until Ross arrived in 1818. Across the Atlantic, a new power was watching. The United States had survived its infancy and was entering a period of explosive growth. The concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the US was destined to expand across the continent, was in full bloom. But for some American thinkers, the continent was not enough. They looked at the map and saw that the security of the United States was tied to the oceans. By the mid-19th century, American whaling ships were among the most active in the world, and many of them were operating in the waters around Greenland. The American presence in the Arctic was growing, not through government decree, but through the grit of sailors and the hunger for whale oil. The first real spark of American official interest came from a man who is often remembered for a single bold purchase, William H. Seward. As the Secretary of State under Presidents Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, Seward was a visionary of American expansion. He believed that for the United States to become a true global power, it needed to control the gateways of trade. In 1867, he successfully negotiated the purchase of Alaska from Russia, a move that was initially mocked as Seward's folly. But Seward wasn't finished. He understood a fundamental geographical truth. The United States was flanked by two massive northern wings, Alaska to the west and Greenland to the east. Seward's interest in Greenland was not a whim. He commissioned a formal report from the United States Coast Survey to investigate the island's resources and strategic value. The report was surprisingly forward-thinking. It spoke of the vast coal deposits found on the Disco Peninsula, which could serve as a vital refueling station for the new age of steamships. It spoke of the fisheries and the potential for mineral wealth. But most importantly, it spoke of geography. Seward saw Greenland and Iceland as potential bridgeheads. If the United States could acquire these islands, it would effectively sandwich the British presence in Canada and secure the entire northern frontier of the Western Hemisphere. In 1867, the same year Alaska was bought, Seward began to quietly sound out the Danish government about the possibility of purchasing Greenland and Iceland. He was a man who thought in centuries, not years. He saw a future where the Arctic would be a central theatre of world commerce and power. However, the timing was difficult. The United States was still reeling from the trauma of the Civil War, and the political appetite for more frozen wastelands was low. In Denmark, the idea was met with a mix of offence and curiosity. Greenland was a matter of national pride, even if it was a financial drain on the Danish treasury. The negotiations never quite took flight, stalled by the complexities of European politics and the distracted nature of the American Congress. Yet, the seed had been planted. Seward had articulated a logic that would resurface again and again over the next 150 years. He argued that Greenland was part of the North American continent and therefore fell under the umbrella of the Monroe Doctrine, the American policy that opposed European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. By this logic, Greenland's Danish status was a historical accident that the United States had a right, and perhaps a duty, to correct. This was the moment Greenland shifted from a missionary's dream to a diplomat's dossier. As the 19th century drew to a close, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration had its counterpart in the north. Explorers like Robert Peary began to use Greenland as their highway to the North Pole. Peary spent years in the northernmost reaches of the island, learning from the Inuit how to survive and travel over the ice. He was the first to prove that Greenland was indeed an island, successfully trekking across its northern tip. Peary was a staunch American nationalist, and he frequently argued that the US should claim the northern parts of Greenland by right of discovery. His expeditions were funded by American millionaires and followed with obsession by the American public. Greenland was becoming part of the American consciousness, a frontier of adventure, a laboratory for science, and a potential extension of the American spirit. While the explorers were mapping the ice, the Danish government was beginning to modernize its administration. They ended the trade monopoly and began to invest more in the welfare and education of the Greenlandic people. A new sense of Greenlandic identity was beginning to emerge, fueled by the introduction of the printing press and a written form of the Greenlandic language. The Inuit were no longer just subjects of a trade company. They were becoming a people with a voice. This created a new layer of complexity for any potential purchase. Greenland was not just a piece of empty real estate. It was a home to a living culture that was increasingly aware of its own place in the world. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Arctic door was wide open. The world was more connected than ever before. The telegraph, the steamship, and the early airplanes were shrinking the globe. In this new, smaller world, the location of Greenland was becoming its most valuable asset. It sat exactly halfway between the great cities of Europe and the rising industrial heartland of North America. As the clouds of the First World War began to gather over Europe, the strategic importance of the North Atlantic was no longer a theoretical debate for men like Seward. It was a matter of national survival. The Danish crown held the keys to this door, but the lock was becoming increasingly heavy. Denmark was a small, neutral nation trying to maintain control over a territory it could neither fully explore nor effectively defend. The United States, now a burgeoning world power, was no longer just asking about coal and fish. It was looking at the map and seeing the future of aerial warfare and global communication. The great white giant was waking up, and the world was beginning to realize that whoever held Greenland held the high ground of the planet. As we conclude this chapter, the stage is set for a collision between Old World colonialism and New World strategy. The era of the lone explorer and the missionary is giving way to the era of the base commander and the geologist. The United States has already made its first quiet offer, and though it was rebuffed, the logic behind it has only grown stronger. The ice is no longer just a barrier, it is becoming a bridge. In the next part of our story, we will see how a world at war finally forced the issue, turning Greenland from a distant Danish colony into the world's largest aircraft carrier, and a front line in the struggle for global dominance. To understand the story of Greenland as an American ambition, we must look closely at a single year, 1867. This was a year of seismic shifts in the geography of power. In the United States, the smoke of the Civil War had barely cleared. The nation was wounded, rebuilding, and looking for a new sense of purpose. In the halls of Washington, D.C., one man was looking far beyond the shattered borders of the South, past the rolling prairies of the West, and straight into the frozen heart of the North. That man was William Henry Seward, the United States Secretary of State. Seward was a man of immense intellect and even greater ego, a statesman who believed that the United States was not just a country, but an unfolding empire of commerce and liberty. To Seward, the map of the world was a puzzle, and he believed he knew where the missing pieces belonged. Seward is most famous for Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire. But what history often forgets is that Alaska was only half of his northern vision. At the same time, he was negotiating with the Tsar's representatives. He was also looking east, across the Atlantic, toward Greenland and Iceland. This was Seward's second dream. He didn't just want to expand American territory, he wanted to dominate the Northern Hemisphere. He saw the world as a theater of naval and telegraphic power, and in that theater, Greenland was the ultimate prize. It was the high ground. If the United States could secure Alaska and Greenland, it would effectively flank the British Empire in Canada and turn the North Atlantic into an American lake. The logic Seward used was rooted in a cornerstone of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. Formulated in 1823, the doctrine essentially told the European powers that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonization. Any attempt by Europe to extend its system to any portion of the Americas would be viewed as a threat to the United States. Seward took this a step further. He argued that because Greenland sat on the North American tectonic plate, it was geographically part of the New World. Therefore, its status as a Danish colony was a historical anomaly that needed to be resolved. In Seward's mind, it wasn't a question of if the United States would acquire Greenland, but when. In the summer of 1867, Seward commissioned a formal report from the United States Coast Survey, titled, "A Report on the Resources of Iceland and Greenland." He wanted cold, hard facts to back up his imperial intuition. The report, authored by Benjamin Peirce, was a remarkable document for its time. It didn't just talk about the beauty of the fjords. It spoke of the strategic and economic potential of the Arctic. The report highlighted the discovery of cryolite, a rare mineral found in Iviktot, Greenland, that was essential for the smelting of aluminum. It spoke of the vast coal beds that could serve as coaling stations, for the new generation of steam-powered warships and merchant vessels. It spoke of the endless banks of cod and halibut that could feed a growing American population. But the most visionary part of the report was about communication. This was the era of the first transatlantic telegraph cables. The world was suddenly becoming connected by electricity. Seward and his advisors realized that a cable laid across the deep, treacherous floor of the central Atlantic was prone to snapping and failure. However, a northern route, running from Canada to Greenland, then to Iceland, and finally to Scotland, would allow for shorter underwater hops. This would make the cable more stable and easier to repair. Seward saw Greenland not as a barrier, but as a bridge, a vital link in the nervous system of the modern world. He believed that whoever controlled the telegraph cables controlled the flow of information and, by extension, the world's wealth. With this report in hand, Seward began his diplomatic gambit. He didn't go to Copenhagen with a formal public offer. That would have been too risky. Instead, he worked through back channels and quiet conversations. He had a close relationship with the Danish minister in Washington, Waldemar Rusloff. Denmark at the time was in a precarious position. It had recently lost a humiliating war against Prussia and Austria, losing the territories of Schleswig and Holstein. The Danish treasury was nearly empty, and the government was struggling to maintain its far-flung Atlantic colonies. Seward sensed an opening. He began to whisper about a price, perhaps $5 million for both Greenland and Iceland. To understand the scale of this ambition, we have to look at the atmosphere of the time. The American public was largely unaware of Seward's Arctic obsession. They were focused on the grueling work of reconstruction and the expansion into the American West. When the Alaska purchase was announced, it was met with widespread mockery. Newspapers called it an icebox and a walrus-covered wilderness. Seward knew that if he announced a second icebox purchase so soon after the first, he would face a political firestorm. So, he moved with a caution that was uncharacteristic of his bold nature. He waited for the right moment, hoping that the strategic logic of the Greenland purchase would eventually become so obvious that the public would have no choice but to support it. But the moment never came. Seward's political capital was tied to President Andrew Johnson, who was becoming increasingly unpopular and was eventually impeached. The Senate, led by men like Charles Sumner, was skeptical of further expansion. Sumner, while a friend of Seward's, believed that the United States should focus on integrating its existing territories rather than collecting new ones in the frozen north. In Denmark, too, the tide was turning. While the Danish government desperately needed money, Greenland was a point of national honor. Selling a piece of the kingdom felt like another defeat, a final admission that Denmark was no longer a player on the world stage. The negotiations stalled, drifting into the long grass of diplomatic delays. Seward left office in 1869, his dream of a Greenland purchase unfulfilled. He died a few years later, and for several decades, his vision was buried in the archives. But ideas like Seward's don't truly die. They simply wait for the world to catch up to them. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the technology he had envisioned began to manifest. The telegraph cables were laid, the steamships were replaced by oil-burning giants, and a new invention, the airplane, was beginning to change the meaning of distance. The early 20th century saw a surge in Arctic exploration that kept Greenland in the headlines. Men like Robert Peary and Knud Rasmussen were no longer just exploring for the sake of science. They were staking claims. Peary, in particular, was an outspoken advocate for American ownership of northern Greenland. He famously said, Greenland is a great North American island, and its possession by the United States is a geographical and political necessity. Peary's expeditions were more than just adventures. They were proof of presence. He lived with the Inuit, learned their ways of travel, and mapped the farthest north of the island. Every American flag he planted in the snow was a quiet echo of Seward's original dream. While the Americans were mapping the ice, the Danish government was forced to take a more active role in Greenland to protect its sovereignty. They began to formalize their administration, moving away from the old trade monopoly and toward a more modern colonial model. They established more permanent settlements and began to provide healthcare and education to the Inuit population. They also faced a challenge from Norway, which claimed parts of East Greenland based on the Old Norse settlements. This dispute eventually went to the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1933, which ruled in favor of Denmark. This legal victory solidified Denmark's all-or-nothing claim to the island, making any future purchase by the United States a matter of negotiating with a single sovereign power. As we look back at 1867, we can see it as the moment the Greenland question was first asked. Seward saw what others could not. That in a globalized world, the most remote places can become the most central. He understood that the Arctic was not a dead end, but a crossroads. His failure to buy the island wasn't a failure of logic, but a failure of timing. He was a man living in the 20th century, while his feet were still planted in the 19th. The silence of the Greenland ice sheet remained, but it was now a silence filled with potential. The icebox was no longer just a place of bone and stone. It was a strategic asset waiting for its moment. That moment would come with a sudden, violent clarity in the middle of the next century, when the world was plunged into a conflict so vast that even the most remote corners of the planet were pulled into the light. The dream Seward had whispered in the drawing rooms of Washington was about to become a matter of life and death for millions. As the shadow of the Second World War began to stretch across the globe, the United States would find itself looking north once again. This time, it wouldn't be a lone Secretary of State dreaming of cables and coaling stations. It would be a nation fighting for its survival, realizing that the great white giant was the only thing standing between the old world and the new. The era of the purchase was about to transition into the era of the protectorate, and the world was about to learn that Greenland was not just an island, but a fortress. The year was 1940, and the world was beginning to burn. While the great cities of Europe were darkening their windows and bracing for the thunder of falling bombs, the vast white expanse of Greenland remained caught in a deep, ancient silence. But this silence was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of a held breath. For decades, the island had been a distant thought in the minds of American strategists, a dream of William Seward's that had never quite materialized. But on a single morning in April, everything changed. The Great White Giant was no longer just a piece of interesting geography or a source of walrus ivory. It had suddenly become the most important piece of strategic territory in the Western Hemisphere. The ice was about to become a shield, and Greenland was about to be pulled into the center of a global struggle for survival. Imagine the stillness of a Greenlandic morning in early spring. The sun, a pale and distant orb, barely clears the jagged peaks of the eastern mountains. The fjords are still locked in ice, a mosaic of deep blues and blinding whites. In the small settlements along the coast, the Inuit were preparing for the spring hunt, unaware that thousands of miles away, the gears of a global machine were grinding toward them. On April 9th, 1940, Nazi Germany launched a sudden and overwhelming invasion of Denmark. Within hours, the small kingdom was occupied, its sovereignty extinguished by a blitzkrieg that left the world reeling. In Washington, D.C., the news sent a shockwave through the White House. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the immediate and terrifying implication. If Denmark had fallen to Hitler, then what would happen to its colonies? Specifically, what would happen to Greenland? In the hands of the Nazis, Greenland could become a launchpad for attacks on North America. German U-boats could use its deep fjords as secret pens, hiding beneath the towering cliffs before slipping out to terrorize the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. German bombers, if they could establish airfields on the coastal plains, could use the island as a refueling station to reach the industrial heartland of the United States. The Monroe Doctrine, which had been a theoretical policy for over a century, was suddenly facing its greatest practical test. The United States could not allow the Nazis to set foot on the island, but Greenland was still technically Danish territory, and the United States was not yet at war. This created a diplomatic and legal nightmare. The Danish government in Copenhagen was under Nazi control, its leaders effectively prisoners of the Reich. They could not speak for the interests of Greenland without a German gun to their heads. However, there was one man who refused to follow orders from an occupied capital. Henrik Kaufmann, the Danish minister to the United States, was a diplomat of extraordinary courage and vision. On the day Denmark was invaded, Kaufmann declared that he would no longer take instructions from Copenhagen. He announced that he was the sole representative of a free Denmark. He understood that the only way to save Greenland from German occupation was to place it under the protection of the United States. For a year, Kaufmann and the American State Department engaged in a delicate, secret dance. They were operating in a legal grey area, navigating a world where the old rules of sovereignty were being shredded by the tides of war. Finally, on April 9th, 1941, exactly 1 year after the fall of Denmark, Kaufmann and Secretary of State Cordell Hull signed the agreement relating to the defense of Greenland. This historic document gave the United States the right to build and operate airfields, seaplane bases, and radio stations on the island. In exchange, the United States guaranteed Greenland's security and the welfare of its people. Kaufmann was immediately fired by the occupied Danish government and charged with high treason, but he did not care. He had successfully turned the Arctic door over to the Americans, ensuring that the Nazis would never hold the high ground of the North. The American arrival in Greenland was a logistical feat of staggering proportions. Thousands of young men from the sun-drenched plains of the Midwest and the humid cities of the South were suddenly transported to a world of absolute white. They arrived in a land where the wind could freeze exposed skin in seconds, and where the ground was so hard that every foundation had to be blasted out with dynamite. Imagine the sound of heavy machinery echoing through a fjord that had known only the sound of waves and wind for 10,000 years. The Americans began construction on a series of bases with cryptic code names like Bluey West 1 and Bluey East 2. Bluey West 1, located at the head of a long fjord in the southwest, became the primary hub. It was a city of Quonset huts and gravel runways, a buzzing island of industry in the middle of the wilderness. The construction crews worked in shifts around the clock during the summer of the midnight sun, racing against the inevitable return of the winter dark. They laid down miles of steel matting for runways and built massive fuel tanks capable of holding millions of gallons of aviation gasoline. These bases were not for combat, but for connection. As the United States began the Lend-Lease program to help Great Britain survive the Blitz, Greenland became the world's largest aircraft carrier. Short-range fighter planes and bombers could not fly across the Atlantic in a single hop. They needed a place to land, refuel, and wait out the unpredictable Arctic storms. Greenland provided that bridge. Thousands of aircraft hopped from Newfoundland to Greenland, then to Iceland, and finally to the airfields of England. Imagine standing on the edge of a gravel runway at Bluey West 1 as a squadron of P-38 Lightnings descends through the mist, their engines roaring against the silence of the glaciers. Without this frozen bridge, the air war over Europe might have been lost. The ice sheet, once a barrier to human travel, was now the vital infrastructure of the Allied cause. The soldiers stationed there lived a strange, isolated existence. They fought a war not against an army, but against the environment. They battled the Arctic blues, a deep depression brought on by the months of total darkness. They spent their days shoveling snow from runways and their nights listening to the radio, trying to catch a faint signal from a world that felt increasingly like a dream. But while the Americans were building their runways, a silent, secret war was being fought on the other side of the island. The east coast of Greenland is one of the most rugged and inaccessible places on Earth, a labyrinth of jagged mountains and pack ice. The Germans knew that if they could not occupy the island, they could at least use it to their advantage. In the age before satellite weather tracking, the weather in Europe was largely determined by the systems moving across the North Atlantic and the Greenland ice sheet. If the German Luftwaffe knew the weather conditions in Greenland, they could predict the weather in London or Berlin 48 hours in advance. This was the weather war. The Nazis began landing small teams of meteorologists and soldiers on the remote eastern coast, setting up secret radio stations to transmit weather data back to the Third Reich. These men lived in tiny camouflaged huts, watching the barometers and the clouds, knowing that their reports could decide the success or failure of a bombing raid on London. To counter this, the United States and the local Danish administrators created one of the most unique military units in history, the Northeast Greenland Sledge Patrol. This was a small group of Danish and Norwegian hunters, along with local Inuit, who patrolled thousands of miles of coastline on dog sleds. They were the eyes and ears of the North. Imagine the sound of 15 dogs pulling a wooden sledge across the frozen sea ice, the only sound for 100 miles. The men of the sledge patrol were masters of the Arctic. They lived in small trapper cabins, enduring temperatures that dropped to 60 degrees below zero. In 1943, this patrol discovered a German weather station on Sabine Island. What followed was a surreal, slow-motion skirmish in the snow. It was the only ground combat of the war to take place on North American soil. The patrol, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, managed to disrupt the German operations, eventually leading to a United States Coast Guard raid that cleared the station. It was a war of nerves and endurance, fought in the silence of the polar night, where a frozen toe or a broken sled runner could be as deadly as a bullet. As the war progressed, the American footprint in Greenland grew deeper. The military began to understand the island's unique environment in ways that scientists never had. They learned about whiteouts, where the sky and the ground blend into a single, featureless void, and a pilot can't tell up from down. They learned how to build structures on permafrost, using deep pilings to ensure that the heat from the buildings wouldn't melt the frozen ground and cause them to sink. They also began to look further north, toward the very top of the island. It was during the war that the foundations for what would become Thule Air Base were laid. Located only 800 miles from the North Pole, Thule was a place where the sun did not rise for 4 months of the year. It was a desolate, windswept plateau, but its location was incomparable. It was a window into the Arctic, a place where a radar dish could see across the curve of the Earth and into the future of aerial warfare. The war also fundamentally changed the lives of the Greenlandic people. For centuries, the Inuit had lived in a state of protected isolation under the Danish trade monopoly. The Danish government had tried to keep the island as a sort of ethnographic museum, limiting contact with the outside world to prevent the erosion of traditional culture. But the war blew those doors wide open. Suddenly, the Inuit were exposed to the overwhelming power of American industrial culture. They saw bulldozers that could move mountains, airplanes that could cross oceans, and thousands of young foreigners with pockets full of chocolate and cigarettes. The Americans brought with them new goods, new technologies, and a new sense of the world's scale. The long silence of the colonial era was gone forever. The Greenlanders were no longer just hunters in a remote outpost. They were participants in a global conflict. They worked on the bases, served as guides for the sledge patrol, and watched as their ancestral lands were transformed into the front lines of a modern war. This exposure created a thirst for change and modernization that would eventually lead to the end of Greenland's colonial status. By 1945, the war was over. The Nazi threat had been extinguished, and the occupied government in Copenhagen was restored. Henrik Kaufmann was exonerated and hailed as a hero for his daring diplomacy. The world began the slow and painful process of celebrating the return of peace. But in the corridors of power in Washington, a new and more cynical realization was taking hold. The United States had spent over $100 million building bases in Greenland. They had mapped its coastlines, studied its weather patterns, and integrated its geography into the core defense of the North American continent. They had seen, with absolute clarity, how vital the island was when the world was at war. And as the shadow of a new conflict, a Cold War with the Soviet Union, began to emerge, the Americans realized they were not ready to give the keys back. The Soviet Union was now the primary threat, and the shortest path for a Soviet bomber to reach New York or Washington was directly over the North Pole and across the Greenland ice sheet. The frozen shield had proven its worth. The logic that William Seward had used in 1867, the idea that Greenland was a necessary flank for the defense of the United States, had been validated by the most brutal conflict in human history. Greenland was no longer just an island. It was a permanent strategic necessity. The Americans had arrived as protectors, but they were beginning to think like owners. They looked at the maps of the new nuclear age and saw that Greenland was the ultimate high ground. It was the place where they could station their early warning radars, their interceptor jets, and perhaps even their own bombers. The gratitude of the post-war years was quickly being replaced by the hard-nosed calculations of global dominance. The United States was about to make an offer that would shock the world and set the tone for the Arctic for the next century. The dream of buying Greenland was about to move from the whispers of the 19th century to the highest levels of the Truman presidency. As the soldiers began to pack their bags and the Quonset huts grew quiet in the summer sun of 1945, the ice remained, as it always had. It was a witness to the brief, frantic activity of the humans on its edges. The glaciers continued their slow crawl to the sea, indifferent to the treaties and the airfields. But the island was different now. It was no longer a ghost on the map. It was a fortress, a bridge, and a prize. The world had learned that whoever controlled Greenland controlled the gateway between the old world and the new. For the United States, that was a gateway they were not yet willing to close. They were about to step out of the role of the temporary guest and into the role of the persistent suitor, offering a mountain of gold for a mountain of ice. The silence of the north was about to be interrupted once again, not by the roar of engines, but by the quiet, high-stakes negotiations of the most powerful men on Earth. Imagine the tension in the rooms of the State Department as they drafted the proposal. They knew that Denmark, though small, was a proud and ancient kingdom. They knew that asking to buy a piece of someone's sovereign territory was a delicate matter, often seen as an insult. But the Americans were confident. They had the gold, they had the momentum, and they believed they had the destiny. They were ready to offer $100 million, an astronomical sum at the time, to make the frozen shield a permanent part of the American empire. The stage was set for the 1946 offer, a moment when the map of the world almost changed forever. Greenland stood at the center of the scales, a giant of ice and bone waiting to see where the balance of history would fall. As the first post-war winter settled over the island, the Americans prepared their bid, convinced that in the new world order, everything, even an island as large as a continent, had a price. The smoke of the Second World War had barely cleared when a new and colder shadow began to stretch across the globe. For 5 years, Greenland had served as a vital bridge between the old world and the new, a frozen shield that protected North America from the reach of the Third Reich. But as the flags of the Allied powers were raised over the ruins of Berlin, the world was not settling into a quiet peace. Instead, it was fracturing. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, born of necessity, was rapidly dissolving into a deep and bitter rivalry. The world was being divided by what Winston Churchill would soon call an Iron Curtain. And as the strategists in Washington looked at the maps of this new bipolar world, they realized that the most important frontier of the future was not in the heart of Europe, but at the very top of the world. The era of the atomic bomb had begun, and in this new age, geography was being rewritten. The Great White Giant was about to become the most valuable piece of real estate on the planet, leading to a secret offer that would stun the Danish government and nearly change the map of the world forever. To understand why the United States wanted to buy Greenland in 1946, we must look at the world through the eyes of a new generation of military planners. Before the war, maps were often viewed as flat rectangles, with the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans acting as vast, insurmountable moats. But the war had taught the Americans to look at the world as a globe. They realized that the shortest distance between the industrial heartland of the United States and the rising power of the Soviet Union was not across the oceans, but directly over the North Pole. This was the era of the Great Circle routes. If Soviet bombers were to attack New York, Chicago, or Washington, they would come from the north. They would fly over the Arctic wastes, and their path would lead them directly over the massive white silence of the Greenland ice sheet. In the logic of the early Cold War, Greenland was no longer just a bridge for ferry flights. It was the front line. It was the place where you could see the enemy coming before they reached your shores. It was the ultimate high ground of the nuclear age. As 1945 turned into 1946, the United States was in a unique position of power. It was the world's only nuclear power. It possessed the largest navy in history, and its economy was booming while the rest of the world lay in ruins. President Harry S. Truman, a man of blunt decisions and practical calculations, saw the continued presence of a small European power like Denmark in the North American Arctic as a strategic liability. The 1941 agreement that had allowed the US to build bases in Greenland was technically a temporary wartime measure. As the war ended, Denmark expected its colony to be returned to its full, exclusive control. But the Americans were not ready to leave. They had invested over $100 million in infrastructure, runways, weather stations, and docks. They saw these installations not as temporary camps, but as the foundation of a permanent Arctic defense system. The dilemma was clear. How could the United States maintain its vital military presence on the island without appearing to be an imperialist power occupying a friendly ally? The answer, in the minds of the Truman administration, was simple. They would buy it. It was a solution that felt quintessentially American. They would offer so much money that the Danish government, struggling to rebuild its war-torn economy, could not afford to say no. The plan was hatched in the highest levels of the State Department and the Pentagon. It was to be a secret move, a quiet diplomatic overture that would avoid the public glare of the United Nations or the press. The man chosen to deliver the offer was Secretary of State James Burns. The moment came in December of 1946, during a meeting of the United Nations in New York. Burns invited the Danish Foreign Minister, Gustav Rasmussen, to a private suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Away from the noise of the diplomats and the photographers, the two men sat down to discuss the future of the North. Imagine the scene in that hotel room. Outside, the lights of New York City were a testament to the surging power of the post-war United States. Inside, James Burns spoke with the calm confidence of a man who represented the world's new superpower. He began by praising Denmark's courage during the occupation and the vital role Greenland had played in the victory over Hitler. But then, he turned to the cold realities of the present. He spoke of the growing threat from the east, the vulnerability of the North American continent, and the immense cost of maintaining Arctic defenses. And then, he made the proposal. He told Rasmussen that the United States was prepared to offer $100 million in gold for the purchase of the entire island of Greenland. To put this in perspective, that was the equivalent of billions of dollars today, a sum that could have instantly wiped out Denmark's national debt and funded its entire post-war reconstruction. The offer also included a potential swap. The United States suggested it might trade its interests in other territories or offer favorable trade deals that would secure Denmark's economic future for generations. Burns framed it not as an act of aggression, but as a necessary geographical adjustment for the security of the Western Hemisphere. He argued that the island was of little economic value to Denmark, a financial drain that required constant subsidies, while for the United States it was a matter of national survival. It was the logic of William Seward from 1867, updated for the era of the B-29 bomber and the atomic cloud. The Americans believed they were offering a fair price for a land that, in their eyes, the Danes could not possibly defend or utilize. Gustav Rasmussen was a career diplomat, a man of refined manners and deep national pride. When Burns finished speaking, the room reportedly fell into a heavy silence. Rasmussen was stunned. He had come to New York to discuss the return of Greenland to Danish administration, not to discuss the sale of a third of the Danish kingdom. To the Danes, Greenland was not just a piece of real estate, it was a matter of sovereign honor. It was the last remnant of their once great Atlantic empire, a place where Danish missionaries, explorers, and administrators had labored for over 200 years. Selling Greenland felt like a betrayal of history, a final admission that Denmark was no longer a sovereign nation, but a client state of the Americans. Rasmussen politely but firmly declined to even consider the offer on the spot, telling Burns that he would have to consult with his government in Copenhagen. When the news of the secret offer eventually reached the Danish cabinet, the reaction was a mixture of shock and quiet indignation. The Danes knew they were in an impossible position. They were a small nation, that had just been liberated by the Allies, and they were now being asked to give up their most significant territory to their primary protector. If they said no too loudly, they risked alienating the United States at a time when they desperately needed American aid and security. If they said yes, they feared a domestic political collapse and the loss of their national soul. The Danish strategy became one of polite, endless delay. They didn't want to sell, but they also didn't want to fight. They began a long process of diplomatic stalling, hoping that the American obsession with buying the island would eventually fade. But the Americans did not give up easily. Throughout 1947 and 1948, the pressure continued. The US military draft reports were filled with maps showing Greenland as the central pivot of the polar world. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of American strategic air power, was a vocal advocate for turning Greenland into a permanent fortress. The logic was reinforced by the 1948 communist coup in Czechoslovakia and the Berlin blockade. The Cold War was no longer a theoretical threat, it was a reality. The Americans argued that if they didn't own Greenland, they couldn't invest the billions of dollars needed to build the kind of deep underground, nuclear-hardened facilities that the New Age required. They saw the Danish presence as a bureaucratic hurdle to the defense of the free world. Yet, as the negotiations dragged on, the Americans began to realize that a purchase might not be necessary to achieve their goals. They saw that they could get everything they wanted, the bases, the airfields, the radar sites, without the political baggage of a formal purchase. If they couldn't own the house, they would simply sign a very long, very favorable lease. This realization led to the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement. This treaty, signed within the framework of the newly formed NATO alliance, gave the United States extensive rights to build and operate defense areas on the island. It was a compromise that allowed Denmark to keep its flag flying over the land, while allowing the United States to turn that land into a massive military installation. It was the birth of the modern Greenlandic status quo: Danish sovereignty, American presence. The 1946 offer, though it failed, changed Greenland forever. It signaled the end of the island's life as a sleepy colonial outpost and its entry into the high-stakes world of global nuclear strategy. The United States began the massive expansion of Thule Air Base, a project so secret and so vast that it was known by the code name Operation Blue Jay. Thousands of workers and millions of tons of equipment were shipped to the far north. They built a 3-mile-long runway on the permafrost and a city of specialized buildings designed to withstand winds of 150 miles per hour and temperatures of 60 below zero. Thule became the northernmost deep-water port in the world, a sentinel looking directly across the pole at the Soviet Union. The silence of the Arctic was now permanently broken by the hum of giant radar dishes and the roar of jet engines. The Inuit of the Thule region paid a heavy price for this strategic calculation. In 1953, to make room for the expansion of the base and its secret missions, the Danish and American authorities forced the local Inuit community to move from their ancestral homes in Uummannaq to a new, artificial settlement further north. They were given only a few days to pack their lives. This forced relocation remains a dark chapter in the island's history, a reminder that in the great games of superpowers, the people who actually live on the land are often the last to be consulted. The great white giant was being transformed into a weapon, and the ancient rhythms of the hunt were being replaced by the 24-hour cycle of the Cold War watch. As the 1950s progressed, The $100 million offer faded into the archives of secret diplomacy, but the underlying reality remained. The United States viewed Greenland as part of its essential security perimeter. The purchase offer had been an attempt to make that reality permanent and legal. While the Danes had successfully defended their sovereignty, they had done so by allowing their island to become the most militarized piece of ice in the world. The Americans had settled for a lease, but they acted like owners. They began to explore the interior of the ice sheet with a new and terrifying ambition. They were no longer just looking for weather stations. They were looking for places to hide their nuclear missiles. As we look back at the 1946 offer, we see a world in transition. It was the moment the United States fully embraced its role as a global empire, willing to use its immense wealth to redraw the maps of the North. It was the moment Denmark realized that its ancient crown was now shadowed by the wings of American bombers. And it was the moment Greenland became a permanent fixture in the American mind, not as a land of people and culture, but as a strategic asset of incomparable value. The $100 million offer was a failure of diplomacy, but it was a triumph of geography. The stage was now set for the most surreal chapter of the story, a secret city built deep inside the ice, where the Cold War would take a turn into the realm of science fiction. The ice was no longer just a shield. It was becoming a hiding place for the end of the world. Imagine the wind howling across the Thule Plateau in the dead of the polar night. The lights of the base are a tiny, glowing island in an ocean of darkness. Beneath those lights, and deep within the glaciers to the east, men were beginning to dream of Project Iceworm. They were planning to build a network of tunnels thousands of miles long, housing hundreds of nuclear missiles, all hidden from the eyes of the world beneath the Greenland ice. The purchase offer of 1946 had been the opening move in a game that was becoming increasingly dangerous and increasingly strange. The ice remained heavy and indifferent, but the world was now using it to store its most lethal secrets. The journey of Greenland through the American centuries was about to enter its coldest and most secretive phase. Imagine the world as a giant clock, where the ticking of the seconds is not the sound of a mechanical gear, but the rhythmic electronic hum of a radar dish scanning the horizon. You are standing on a desolate, windswept plateau in the far north of Greenland, 800 miles from the North Pole. It is the middle of the polar night. The sun has not been seen for 3 months, and it will not return for another one. Above you, the stars are brilliant and unblinking, and the green curtains of the aurora borealis dance across the sky in a silent, ghostly ballet. But your eyes are not on the stars. They are on the massive steel structures that loom out of the darkness, the giant ears of the ballistic missile early warning system. This is Thule Air Base. In the 1950s and 60s, this was the most important spot on the planet. It was the Silent Sentinel, a billion-dollar fortress built on a foundation of ice and secrecy. For the United States, Greenland had moved beyond being a potential purchase or a wartime bridge. It had become the vital organ of national survival, the place where the nuclear age reached its coldest and most surreal peak. As the Cold War deepened, the strategic logic that had led to the $100 million offer in 1946 became even more intense. The Soviet Union had developed its own atomic weapons and the long-range bombers to deliver them. The shortest path for those bombers to reach the heart of America was still directly over the North Pole. To defend against this threat, the United States needed more than just a refueling stop. They needed a permanent, eyes-on-the-sky presence. In 1951, under the cover of a massive operation known as Blue Jay, The United States transformed the tiny outpost of Thule into a sprawling military city. Thousands of men and millions of tons of equipment were moved into the high Arctic. Because the ground was permanent frost, every building had to be constructed on stilts or specialized foundations, so the heat of the barracks wouldn't melt the ground and cause the city to sink into the mud. Life at Thule was a study in isolation. The men who served there lived in a world of absolute extremes. They worked in Phase 3 weather, where the wind reached over 100 miles per hour and the visibility dropped to zero. In such storms, a man could get lost and freeze to death just 10 feet from his barracks door. They lived on a diet of canned food and movies. Their only connection to the outside world, a flickering radio signal, and the occasional arrival of a supply plane. It was a life lived on the edge of the world, for the sake of the world. But while Thule was the visible face of the American presence, something far more mysterious and ambitious was happening deep inside the ice sheet. In 1959, the United States Army began construction on a project that sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. It was called Camp Century, also known as the City Under the Ice. Located about 150 miles inland from Thule, Camp Century was a network of tunnels carved directly into the glaciers. It was powered by the world's first portable nuclear reactor, and it contained laboratories, a library, a hospital, and even a bowling alley. To the public, it was presented as a scientific research station, a place to study the Arctic environment. But Camp Century had a secret purpose, a mission so sensitive that even the Danish government was not fully informed of its true scale. This was Project Iceworm. The plan behind Project Iceworm was as audacious as it was terrifying. The United States military wanted to build a vast underground railway system beneath the Greenland ice sheet, stretching over 52,000 square miles. Within this network of tunnels, they planned to station 600 nuclear missiles on mobile launchers. These missiles would be constantly on the move, hidden from Soviet satellites and protected by miles of solid ice. If a nuclear war broke out, these missiles could be launched from the ice sheet, striking deep into Soviet territory. It was the ultimate hidden hand strategy. For the Americans, the ice was no longer just a shield, it was a cloak. They saw the interior of Greenland as a massive, empty expanse where they could play the most dangerous game in history without anyone knowing. However, the Great White Giant proved to be a more difficult host than the engineers had anticipated. The ice sheet was not a static block. It was a moving, shifting river of frozen water. The glaciers flowed and compressed with a slow, irresistible force. Within a few years of its construction, the tunnels of Camp Century began to deform. The walls bowed inward, the ceilings sagged, and the heavy machinery began to be crushed by the weight of the shifting ice. By 1966, the military realized that their secret city was being slowly eaten by the island itself. Project Iceworm was abandoned, the nuclear reactor was removed, and the tunnels were left to collapse. The military walked away, leaving behind thousands of tons of waste, fuel, and radioactive coolant, believing that the ice would keep their secrets buried forever. It was a rare moment of humility for a superpower, a reminder that even the most advanced technology is no match for the ancient geological power of the North. As the secret of the tunnels faded, a much more public and visible disaster struck the island in 1968. In the middle of the Cold War, the United States maintained a policy of Chrome Dome, keeping a fleet of B-52 bombers in the air 24 hours a day, each armed with multiple hydrogen bombs, ready to fly toward the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. On January 21, 1968, one of these bombers, carrying 4 powerful nuclear weapons, caught fire over the North Baffin Bay. The crew was forced to bail out, and the massive aircraft crashed onto the sea ice just 7 miles from the runway at Thule Air Base. The impact was cataclysmic. The high explosives in the bombs detonated on impact, shattering the weapons and spraying radioactive plutonium across the ice and into the freezing water. The Thule accident was a geopolitical nightmare. Denmark had a strict policy of being a nuclear-free zone, and the presence of American hydrogen bombs on Danish soil, even in the form of a crash, was a massive violation of public trust. The crash site was a scene of surreal, glowing devastation. American and Danish teams, dressed in white protective suits, spent months in the brutal Arctic winter trying to recover the debris. They scraped up thousands of tons of contaminated snow and ice, packing them into steel drums to be shipped back to the United States. They called it Project Crested Ice, but to the local Inuit who lived and hunted in those waters, it was a permanent scar. For years, rumors persisted that one of the 4 bombs had never been fully recovered, that it had sunk through the ice and remained on the seafloor, a silent, radioactive ghost. The crash forced a major reckoning in the relationship between Washington and Copenhagen, leading to new treaties and a more cautious approach to the American presence. It was a stark reminder that the silent sentinel came with a terrifying price. Throughout these decades of the Cold War, the people of Greenland were often treated as secondary characters in the drama of their own land. The Inuit, whose ancestors had lived on the island for thousands of years, watched as their hunting grounds were turned into radioactive crash sites, and their ancestral homes were relocated to make room for radar dishes. Yet, this period also sowed the seeds of a new consciousness. The exposure to the outside world, the influx of technology, and the obvious strategic importance of their home led to a growing movement for self-determination. The Greenlanders began to realize that they were sitting on the most valuable real estate on Earth, and they wanted a seat at the table. They began to question the colonial relationship with Denmark and the military dominance of the United States. The silence of the North was no longer just a lack of sound. It was the quiet before a political storm. As the Cold War reached its final chapters in the 1980s, the role of Greenland began to shift once again. The invention of intercontinental ballistic missiles meant that the bomber routes over the pole were less central than they once were. Satellite technology began to replace some of the ground-based radar systems. The Great White Giant was no longer the only way to see the enemy, but Greenland's value did not disappear. It merely transformed. The island remained a vital node in the global network of communications and surveillance. Thule was updated with the latest phased array radars, capable of tracking objects the size of a basketball in deep space. The island was no longer just a fortress. It was a laboratory and a listening post. Looking back at this era, we see Greenland as a place where the most extreme human ambitions met the most extreme natural environment. The United States had tried to buy the island for gold in 1946, and when that failed, they had tried to occupy its interior with nuclear tunnels. They had treated the ice sheet as a blank canvas for their strategic dreams. But the ice had pushed back. It had crushed the tunnels of Camp Century and swallowed the secrets of Project Iceworm. The 1968 crash had shown the fragility of the frozen shield and the high stakes of the nuclear standoff. Through it all, the island remained, a silent, white sentinel, watching the folly of man from the top of the world. As the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved, the world breathed a sigh of relief. The immediate threat of a nuclear exchange over the North Pole seemed to vanish overnight. The barracks at Thule grew quieter, and the secret projects were relegated to the history books. For a brief moment in the 1990s, it seemed that Greenland might return to being a peaceful, remote periphery, a place of glaciers and quiet fjords. But history is never finished with a place so large and so strategically located. Even as the Cold War ended, a new and perhaps even more profound transformation was beginning. The ice, which had been the defining feature of the island for millions of years, was starting to change in ways that no general or scientist had predicted. The next chapter of the Greenland story would not be written in secret tunnels or with hydrogen bombs. It would be written in the melting of the glaciers and the warming of the oceans. The strategic value of the island was about to be rediscovered, not by men looking for missile sites, but by men looking for resources and new shipping lanes. The American obsession with Greenland was not over. It was merely entering its modern phase. The Great White Giant was about to become the center of a new kind of global struggle, one where the prize was not just survival, but the very future of the planet's economy. The silence was ending, and the world was turning its gaze northward once again, realizing that the most important real estate on Earth was about to become accessible in a way it had never been before. As we leave the era of the Cold War, we leave behind a landscape littered with the remnants of abandoned dreams, the crushed tunnels, the empty runways, and the silent radar dishes. But we also leave behind a people who have survived the giants. The Inuit of Greenland were moving toward a new era of home rule and independence, ready to take control of their own destiny, just as the rest of the world was beginning to realize what a treasure they truly possessed. The story of the American centuries in Greenland was about to move from the shadows of the nuclear age into the bright, uncertain light of the 21st century. The ice was melting, and the secrets it held were about to be revealed to a world that was once again hungry for the North. For decades, the Great White Giant of the North seemed to have settled back into a quiet, frozen rhythm. After the high-stakes drama of the Cold War, the secret tunnels of Project Iceworm, and the terrifying roar of B-52s, the world's attention had drifted away from the Arctic. Greenland returned, in the popular imagination, to being a place of postcards, a land of massive icebergs, lonely hunters, and a distant, peaceful connection to the Kingdom of Denmark. But beneath the surface, the world was changing. The silence of the ice was being replaced by a new sound, the rhythmic, persistent drip of melting water. As the 21st century unfolded, the very substance that had protected Greenland for millennia, the ice, began to retreat, revealing a landscape that the modern world suddenly found irresistible. The strategic shield of the 1940s was being replaced by something even more powerful, the lure of unimaginable wealth and the shifting of the Earth's trade routes. In 2019, the world was shocked by a headline that felt like a ghost from the 19th century. President Donald Trump had expressed a serious interest in the United States purchasing Greenland. The media laughed, the Danish government was insulted, and the world paused in disbelief. But to those who had been watching the Arctic, this wasn't a joke. It was the latest move in a centuries-long gambit, a recognition that the Great White Giant was about to become the most important piece of real estate in the 21st century. To understand the 2019 offer, we must first understand the physical transformation of the island itself. For thousands of years, the Greenland ice sheet was a barrier. It was a miles-thick wall of frozen water that made the interior of the island inaccessible and its minerals unreachable. But as the global climate began to warm, the Arctic started changing twice as fast as the rest of the planet. Billions of tons of ice began to melt into the sea every year. As the glaciers retreated, they left behind exposed land that had been hidden since before the dawn of human history. This wasn't just bare rock. This was the new frontier. Geologists began to realize that Greenland sat atop a treasure chest of the minerals that power the modern world. Specifically, the island is believed to hold some of the world's largest deposits of rare earth elements. Minerals like neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium. These are not just names on a periodic table. They are the essential ingredients for everything from smartphones and electric vehicle batteries to wind turbines and advanced missile guidance systems. In the 21st century, rare earth minerals are the new oil, and Greenland might just be the new Saudi Arabia. The geopolitical problem for the United States was that, for years, China had been quietly securing a near monopoly on these minerals. Washington looked at the map and realized that its transition to a green economy and its military technology were both dependent on Chinese supply chains. Then they looked north. They saw a Greenland that was melting, becoming more accessible, and sitting on the very resources they needed. But they weren't the only ones looking. In 2018, China officially declared itself a near-Arctic state. They began speaking of a polar Silk Road, a new shipping lane that would open as the Arctic ice disappeared, cutting weeks off the travel time between Asia and Europe. China began offering to build massive new airports in Greenland and to invest billions in mining projects. For the United States, the alarm bells were ringing. The ghost of the Monroe Doctrine returned with a vengeance. The Americans realized that if they didn't act, the Great White Giant could become a strategic outpost for their greatest global rival. This was the context for the 2019 purchase incident. It wasn't just a whim of a real estate mogul turned president. It was a blunt public expression of a deep-seated American anxiety. When the news broke that the White House had asked its advisors to look into the possibility of buying Greenland, the reaction in Denmark was one of visceral shock. The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, called the idea absurd, stating firmly that Greenland is not for sale. She pointed out a fundamental truth that the Americans seem to have overlooked. Greenland is not a colony to be traded between empires anymore. Since 1979, the island had moved toward home rule, and since 2009, it had achieved self-rule. The people of Greenland, the Inuit who had lived there for thousands of years, were the ones who would decide their own future. The days when James Burns could offer gold for ice in a New York hotel room were gone. The Great White Giant had found its own voice. But if the purchase offer was diplomatically clumsy, the logic behind it was incredibly resilient. After the initial firestorm of headlines faded, the United States did not walk away. Instead, they changed their tactics. They realized that in the 21st century, you don't buy the land, you buy the influence. The US began a charm offensive in the north. In 2020, for the first time in decades, the United States opened a permanent consulate in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland. They announced millions of dollars in aid packages for education, tourism, and the mining industry. They began a series of high-level diplomatic visits, emphasizing the special relationship between Washington, Nuuk, and Copenhagen. They successfully pressured the Danish government to reject Chinese funding for the new airports, with the US offering its own support instead. The Americans were back, not as buyers, but as the partner of choice. Imagine the atmosphere in Nuuk today. It is a city in the midst of a transformation. Cranes dot the skyline, as new hotels and government buildings rise against the backdrop of the mountains. In the cafes, you can hear a mix of Greenlandic, Danish, and increasingly American English. There is a sense of being at the center of a new world order. The Greenlanders themselves are navigating a complex path. On one hand, the melting ice is a tragedy. It threatens their traditional way of life, the hunting of seals and the travel by dog sled. On the other hand, it offers a path to full independence. If Greenland can harness its mineral wealth and its strategic position, it could finally become a sovereign nation, free from the subsidies and control of Denmark. For many Greenlanders, the American interest is both an opportunity and a threat. They want the investment, but they don't want to be a pawn in a new Cold War between Washington and Beijing. The 2019 Gambit also highlighted a shift in how we think about the Arctic door. During the Cold War, the door was a defensive one, a place to watch for bombers and missiles. Today, the door is an economic one. As the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route become viable for more months of the year, Greenland sits like a massive toll booth at the top of the Atlantic. The nation that controls the waters around Greenland will control the trade of the future. This is why the US Coast Guard has begun increasing its presence in the region, and why the US Navy is talking about Arctic freedom of navigation operations. The silent sentinel of Thule Air Base is still there, but it is being joined by a new generation of scientists, miners, and diplomats. The ice is no longer a shield, it is a resource. The story of the modern Gambit is the story of a world that has suddenly realized that its future is tied to its most remote corner. When we look at the 2019 offer through the lens of history, we see that it wasn't an isolated event. It was a continuation of William Seward's dream from 1867 and Harry Truman's offer from 1946. It was the latest expression of an American geographical destiny that has always seen Greenland as part of its own map. But the world of 2019 is a world of self-determination and globalized markets. The great white giant is no longer a passive object to be bought and sold. It is a living, breathing society of 56,000 people who are watching the ice melt and the world arrive, and who are determined to be the masters of their own frozen, or increasingly green, destiny. The 2019 offer served as a wake-up call for the entire world. It forced Denmark to pay more attention to its northern territory, and it forced the European Union to realize that they had a major strategic asset right on their doorstep. It made the people of Greenland realize just how much leverage they actually have. The absurd idea of a purchase turned out to be the catalyst for a new era of Arctic diplomacy. The silence of the north is now filled with the sound of prospectors' drills and the chatter of international conferences. The great melt has revealed more than just rock and minerals. It has revealed a new theatre of global power. As we look toward the final chapter of our story, we see a Greenland that is standing at a crossroads. The ice continues to melt, the water continues to rise, and the superpowers continue to circle. The American centuries in Greenland have been a long, slow pursuit of a prize that always seemed just out of reach. From the ivory hunters of the Norse, to the base commanders of the Cold War, to the diplomats of the rare earth age, the island has been a constant obsession. The next part of the story will not be about buying or selling, but about the future of a land that is changing faster than our ability to understand it. The great white giant is waking up, and the world is finally beginning to listen to what it has to say. Imagine the sound of a massive glacier carving into the sea, a roar like thunder that echoes for miles. It is the sound of a world in transition. In the 21st century, Greenland is the canary in the coal mine for the planet's climate and the prize for the planet's economy. The 2019 gambit was just a symptom of a much deeper shift. The United States has always known that Greenland was the key to the North. They have tried to buy it with gold, protect it with steel, and influence it with aid. As the ice disappears, the reality of Seward's second dream is becoming more apparent every day. The Arctic is no longer the end of the world. It is the beginning of the next one. We are left with a landscape of incredible beauty and terrifying change. The blue-hued glaciers are still there, for now, reflecting the midnight sun. But the world that looks at them is different. It is a world that sees the minerals beneath the ice, the shipping lanes across the water, and the strategic high ground above it all. The journey of the United States in Greenland is a story of a nation that has always looked north and seen its own reflection in the ice. As we move into the future, that reflection is becoming clearer, even as the ice itself begins to fade. The story of the Greenland Purchase is not a story of the past. It is a story of a future that is arriving with every drop of melting water. We have traveled across 1,000 years of history to reach this moment, standing on the edge of a future that is arriving faster than the maps can be updated. We have seen Greenland through the eyes of Eric the Red, looking for a new kingdom in the fjords. We have seen it through the eyes of William Seward, dreaming of telegraph cables and coaling stations. We have seen it as a frozen shield in the Second World War and a nuclear sentinel in the Cold War. But as we stand here today, in the mid-20s of a new century, the story of Greenland is no longer just a story of what empires want. It is a story of what the land itself is becoming, and what the people who have called it home for 5,000 years are finally ready to claim. The Great White Giant is no longer a passive backdrop for the ambitions of others. It is a living, breathing nation in the making, and its journey toward the horizon is about to reshape the world once again. If you were to fly over Greenland today, you would see a landscape in the midst of a profound and beautiful yet terrifying transformation. The massive glaciers, some of which have held their ground for over 100,000 years, are retreating. You can see the dark, ancient rock emerging from beneath the white shroud, a land that has not seen the sun since before the first humans walked the earth. This melting is the central pulse of the 21st century. It is the reason why the world's superpowers are circling the island with a renewed and frantic interest. But to the 57,000 people who live here, the melting is not just a strategic headline. It is a fundamental shift in the rhythm of life. The hunters in the north are finding the sea ice too thin for their dog sleds. The fishermen in the south are seeing new species of fish moving into the warming waters. The silence of the Arctic is being replaced by the sound of water, millions of tons of it, cascading off the ice sheet and into the rising oceans. For the United States, this transformation has reignited a centuries-old obsession. In the early weeks of 2026, the world watched as the Greenland question returned to the center of global diplomacy with a force and a friction that few had anticipated. The rhetoric of purchase and acquisition, which had simmered for decades, suddenly boiled over into a full-scale international crisis. We have seen how President Donald Trump's renewed interest in the island led to a confrontation that pitted the United States against its oldest allies in Europe. To the Americans, the logic remained as stark as it was in 1946. Greenland is the high ground of the North American continent. In a world where Russia is modernizing its Arctic bases and China is building a polar Silk Road, the United States views the island as an essential piece of national security. They see it as the site for the next generation of defense systems, like the Golden Dome missile shield, and as the gateway to the mineral treasures that will power the future. But the world of 2026 is not the world of William Seward. The idea that a sovereign territory can be bought like a piece of commercial real estate has met a wall of resistance that is as solid as the inland ice. The Danish government, supported by the European Union and NATO, has made it clear that Greenland's status is not a matter for negotiation between superpowers. They have stood firm on the principle of territorial integrity, even in the face of tariffs and diplomatic threats. The Greenland crisis of today is a reminder that the Arctic is no longer a remote periphery where the rules of international law don't apply. It is a place where the sovereignty of small nations is being tested against the weight of global giants. Yet, the most important voice in this drama is not coming from Washington, Copenhagen, or Brussels. It is coming from Nuuk. The people of Greenland, the Inuit, who have survived the rise and fall of every empire that has tried to claim their land, are looking toward a different future. Since the Self-Rule Act of 2009, the island has possessed the legal right to declare independence whenever its people choose. In the general election of 2025, the debate over independence moved from a distant dream to an immediate political reality. We saw a population that is 85% opposed to becoming part of the United States, yet deeply committed to ending 3 centuries of Danish colonial rule. The Greenlanders are playing a sophisticated game of Arctic paradiplomacy. They are using the global interest in their minerals and their geography to build the economic foundation they need to finally stand alone. This is the true prize of the Great White Giant, the minerals that lie beneath the melting ice. Greenland holds some of the world's largest deposits of rare earth elements, the hidden ingredients of the digital and green revolutions. From the Kvanefjeld and Tambrise mines in the south, the island could potentially supply the entire world with the materials needed for electric cars, wind turbines, and advanced electronics. But for the people of Narsak and other local communities, the choice is a difficult one. Do they open their pristine landscape to massive industrial projects that could poison their waters and destroy their traditional hunting grounds? Or do they keep the land as it is and remain dependent on the 4 billion kroner annual block grant from Denmark? This is the central tension of the modern Arctic, the choice between economic survival and cultural preservation. As we look toward the next few decades, the map of the North will likely look very different. Greenland is moving, slowly but surely, toward a status that may look less like a colony and more like a free associated state. It is a model where Greenland could achieve full sovereignty, with its own seat at the United Nations, while perhaps delegating its defense to a larger partner, be it Denmark, the United States, or a collective NATO mission. This would allow the silent sentinel of the North to finally have a say in who stands on its shores. The goal is a future where the phrase, "nothing about us without us," is not just a slogan, but a lived reality. The story of the United States trying to buy Greenland over the centuries is in the end a story about the power of geography. It is a story of how a frozen island at the top of the world can be the pivot point for the fate of civilizations. But it is also a story about the limits of that power. No matter how many millions or billions of dollars are offered, no matter how many radar dishes are built, the land itself has always had the final word. The ice crushed the secret tunnels of the 1960s, and the people of the land are now pushing back against the annexations of the 2020s. Greenland is reminding the world that it is not a blank space on a map to be colored in by a foreign hand. It is a place of history, of bone, of stone, and of a future that belongs to those who have the patience to live with the ice. Close your eyes and imagine that silent plateau one last time. The wind is still there, a low hum that has echoed through the eons. The aurora is still dancing, green and ethereal against the black sky. But the landscape is waking up. The great white giant is stretching its limbs. The US consulate in Nuuk is busy with diplomats. The European Union is opening its own offices, and the Inuit are drafting their first national constitution. The century of the purchase is ending, and the century of the partner is beginning. The ice will continue to melt, and the world will continue to change, but the island will remain, a monument to human resilience and a reminder that some things are simply beyond price. As the midnight sun begins to dip toward the horizon, only to rise again without ever having set, we can see the full circle of the Greenland story. It began with a Norseman's deceptive name, a promise of green in a world of white. It moved through centuries of isolation and decades of nuclear dread, and it has arrived at a moment of profound choice. The Greenland Purchase may remain one of history's most persistent what-ifs, a dream that haunted American presidents for generations. But as the ice gives way to the sea and the old world gives way to the new, the true value of Greenland is being revealed. It is the value of a people finally coming into their own, in a land that is as beautiful as it is uncompromising. The journey of the North is just beginning, and the world is finally, after all these centuries, truly watching.